Thank you, everyone. I was told that Williams audiences are always extremely polite and that no one would ask questions during the course of my remarks, but instead would wait to the end. But I hope you all took advantage of the wonderful Reunion book that our classmates made, and thanks again to Jill and Karen and to Barb Halligan, who I also understood helped very much. Thanks to you all. Thanks. Thanks to you all, we were all able to reread Tom Perkins' excellent speech on the importance of not being polite. And I want to say that I don't think this means not being nice, because one of the things we all love about being here is that everyone is so nice, and it's a wonderful group of people. But you don't have to be polite, and if there's something you're dying to ask while I'm making my remarks, please raise your hand, and I'd love to take questions either during or after or both. So please feel free to do that. I am going to focus on really the terrorism side of this, because you all know as well as or much better than I do what liberal arts means and the importance of it. So I thought perhaps the most interesting thing to do with these remarks today would be to draw you into what it's like on the inside to address terrorism, and to talk about in specifically two things that I've done during the course of my work for the Department of Justice. Jordan just basically went through my background since graduating from Williams. When I first started as a prosecutor, I was hired by the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. At that time, that was Eric Holder. And he hired me as a prosecutor, and he then later left the office. He was Deputy Attorney General and then was in private practice for a while. But I stayed on as a prosecutor for 13 years, and at the end of that 13 years, he was appointed Attorney General by President Obama, so he asked me to come back to Main Justice and work on national security issues, which I did some as a prosecutor. So those are the two things that I'm going to talk about. One is a case that I worked on when I was National Security Chief at the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., and that is the investigation of the 2001 anthrax attacks. The other matter I will talk about, although somewhat more briefly, is the effort to close Guantanamo and the considerations of what to do with the detainees there, and in particular, what to do with those who could be prosecuted, including the ones responsible for the 9/11 attacks. So those are just two things that I'll talk about, but again, feel free to interrupt along the way. Which button do I push? I thought it might be interesting to talk about the anthrax case, because it is very interesting, and it's also not terribly well known what happened during the course of the investigation. I think most of you will remember that there were some mailings of anthrax powder during 2001, and that in the beginning, no one really knew whether this was Al-Qaeda, whether this was the same group that had brought down the World Trade Towers, and there was a lot of speculation about who was responsible. You may also remember that at one point there was a suspect who was very high profile, discussed a lot in the media, and that suspect turned out not to be the person who was responsible for the attacks. Then the case came to an end back in 2008, when the person who was responsible took his own life, and that brought the case to a tragic conclusion, and it was an unfortunate development, and I'll talk about that in a little bit of detail. But other than that, you may not know all of the detail about what went into the investigation and what we, the prosecutors and the FBI agents on the case, did. So that's what I want to focus on in the first bit of this talk. Starting with just giving you a timeline of what happened, just to remind you. You may remember the first victim of these attacks was a man who lived in Florida by the name of Robert Stevens. He was diagnosed with anthrax on October 3rd, 2001, and he died a few days later. And no one had died of anthrax poisoning for, I don't know when. I mean, everyone sort of in the scientific community knew what anthrax was and that it was deadly. But this was the first very prominent instance of someone actually dying from it, so it was unclear what the source was, and again, that heightened everyone's concern that this was terrorism. Then after Robert Stevens died, there were a number of letters that were recovered, letters to Tom Brokaw, to Senator Daschle, to Senator Leahy, and one to the New York Post. There were a number of other deaths. Thomas Morris and Joseph Curseen were two postal workers in the Brentwood postal facility, which is just outside Washington, D.C. And then we don't really know what the exposure was that killed the other 2 victims in New York and Connecticut, but presumably some kind of exposure to the powder that had been in the letters that went to New York. So that's the timeline. The letters themselves, these are 3 of the 4 letters that were recovered. The one to Senator Leahy was identical to the one to Senator Daschle, except for the senators' names. Otherwise, it was the same letter photocopied that was put in the envelope and the same return address. So those 4 envelopes and those 4 letters were the key pieces of evidence in the case in the beginning, because once they were recovered, everyone knew that these were the source of the anthrax, because the letters that went to Capitol Hill and the one that went to Tom Brokaw all had powder still in them when they were recovered. So the powder itself was also a key piece of evidence, and I'll talk about that. Now, I didn't work on the case in the very beginning. I was a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. At that time, I was doing mostly homicides and gang cases and trying a lot of cases. But it was before I was made chief of the National Security Section. So I knew that our office had the investigation, and I followed it somewhat, but it wasn't really a focus of what I was doing. But I knew that Stephen Hatfill had been named as a person of interest because his name was actually used in a very public statement that the Attorney General made, and that became very controversial when he insisted that he had not done it and sued the Department of Justice and other people. And so that was widely known and really somewhat unfortunate that he had been named as a person of interest when he ultimately was found not responsible. But at the time that he was a person of interest, there were a lot of things that had drawn the investigators to focus on him. And they were never focusing exclusively on him, but he was one of a number of people who were being looked at very closely in the beginning. He later sued and settled his case against the Department of Justice before actually the case was closed. But why was he a suspect? He had access to the Ames strain of anthrax. The investigators concluded fairly early on that the anthrax that was in the envelopes was part of the Ames strain, which was named after Ames, Iowa, one of the places where it had been. It was actually first found in a cow in Texas, I believe. But it became known as the Ames strain, and it was one of few anthrax samples that were the basis for a lot of anthrax research at the time. So in the scientific community, this was widely known, and there were a lot of samples of Ames, which I'll get to in a bit. He was an anthrax scientist himself, Hatfill, and had worked with the Ames strain. In addition, 8 people had called in. Of course, the FBI, as they often do, set up a tip line, and 8 people had called in to report him as a possible suspect because he had been acting very oddly. He'd been boasting about his work on anthrax. He had some personal quirks. He had some personal vendettas that people found odd, and he was warning others about the dangers of anthrax, and 8 people were suspicious enough to call the FBI. So that was a fairly significant, but ultimately not incriminating fact. He also had anthrax material at home, which was odd, and perhaps most circumstantially and coincidentally, he had 2 prescriptions for Cipro, the antibiotic used to treat anthrax poisoning, and they were refilled 2 days before each of the mailing windows. And by mailing window, I mean the window during which the letters were mailed based on the postmarks on the letters. So that was very suspicious. Someone who knew that the anthrax was going to be out there contaminating the public would have had a reason to get a Cipro prescription before that happened. So this was very odd. And there were a number of other circumstantial links, none of which were as substantial as those. But that's why he became a person of interest. We don't say that anymore in the Department of Justice. It's banned. But that's why he became a subject, really, of the investigation. And ultimately, the evidence was not sufficient to charge him, and the prosecutor in charge of the case did not think that the evidence was sufficient to charge him, quite rightly so. And ultimately, he was exonerated. And the reason why he was exonerated was because scientific progress was going on in this field at the same time that this investigation was going on. So in 2001, scientists could only say that the powder in the letters was the Ames strain of anthrax. But there was a lot of progress in the field of, some of you all are going to know this stuff better than I do, so this is embarrassing, but microbiology forensics, or forensic microbiology. I'm not sure I even have that right, but the field of basically genetic identification. And scientists were increasingly able to look at the specific characteristics of the spores and to determine much more narrowly where they could be traced to. So you could look at not just the Ames strain, but individual samples of it that had been collected from all the labs that had the Ames strain in 2001. So these developments were really taking place in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, and the science was getting better, and the FBI was working very closely with the scientific community to see if they could determine where the anthrax powder that was mailed had originally come from. And in about 2007, they actually had experts who were willing to say that it came from this one flask that was called RMR 1029, and that became the key piece of evidence. And in fact, that was the murder weapon, really. So this was a big breakthrough. And as I said, I took over the National Security Section and therefore this investigation in early 2007. And this was right around the time that this development was reached. I had nothing to do with it, but it was lucky, really, that the case was at a stage where there was some really important work that, that could be done based on being able to narrow this to this one flask, and therefore the suspects had to be people who had access to this one flask. The first thing I did, the attorney, the prosecutor who had been on the case, who was very, very good, had a big trial coming up that summer. He was involved in a terrorism trial against a FARC leader from Colombia. And so he didn't have a lot of time to devote to the case. And I thought it would be good to put a new prosecutor on, both to help him and also to sort of take over the case while he was in trial, and then also just to add someone else on the investigation at a time when there was going to be a lot of work to do. So I had a very good friend in the office who was an experienced trial lawyer who had also had a lot of experience dealing with scientific evidence in some of her cases. And I also knew her very well, and I trusted her. And so I put her on the case, and she also was one of these people who had a personality. There were a lot of really high-powered people working on the case within the FBI and the Department of Justice. And she had this personality where she could just walk into a room and say something funny and make everyone feel at ease. And it really helped the communication and the cooperation on the team. So that was probably my greatest contribution, because I wasn't handling this myself. I was just supervising it. But the first thing she did was to take a look at the evidence, particularly the scientific evidence, to determine whether, in fact, as the FBI was saying, this was evidence that really proved where the anthrax had derived from. So just to back up a little bit, when the powder was recovered and it was determined that it was Ames strain anthrax, the FBI collected all of the samples from all of the labs that were known to have Ames. And this is fatal. It's important to remember that this is a fatal substance. So you can't handle it, you can't keep it in your garage and handle it in your garage. You have to handle it under very controlled circumstances in a laboratory. So we didn't think, for good reason, that there was a lot of it out there that wasn't very well documented and maintained by laboratories. But we did look at the possibility that there were overseas, that Al-Qaeda had access to anthrax. All of that was investigated, but there was no evidence that anthrax existed outside of the laboratories that had documented their samples. So the FBI collected a total of more than 1,000 samples. And once these new developments, new scientific developments came through, they went back and compared all of the 1,027 samples to the powder that was in the letters. And they were able to conclude that 8 of the samples matched the powder. And this was blind, without knowing where those samples came from, but they then found that all 8 of those samples derived from the flask that I just showed up there. And this was therefore ruled to be the murder weapon. Most of the samples came directly from that flask. A couple had come from Dr. Ivins, who was ultimately the suspect, had sent a sample of RMR 1029 to another lab. So it was at 2 labs, but this was the main flask. So this was then the key breakthrough. And once you knew that this flask was the murder weapon, the main person of interest became Dr. Bruce Ivins, because he was the person who had custody of that flask. If you wanted access to that anthrax sample, you had to go through Dr. Ivins. And he was an anthrax researcher at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, known by its acronym USAMRID, and that was in Frederick, Maryland. And so, of course, the investigators started to look very closely then at Dr. Ivins. And they found immediately that there were a couple of very suspicious circumstances. Not only did he obviously have custody of this flask of anthrax, but as an anthrax researcher, he had a very specialized body of knowledge and expertise that, there we go, that enabled him to work with it. So he was one of a very small number of people, really, who could have possibly converted what was in that flask to powder and put it in letters to mail, as had happened in the attacks. So he became a key suspect. He also had very suspicious hours in the lab right around the time that the letters were mailed. And I'll go into some detail about that because I find that to be probably the key piece of evidence. He also had access to and training on a lyophilizer, which is something that dries anthrax and can be used to convert it into powder, although really very few people know how to do this, and it's possible he used some other equipment because he really knew how to do this better than anyone else. But we think that he had the access to the equipment that could have been used to do this. But to look for a minute at the lab hours. He had worked at the lab for more than 20 years. And so the investigators were able to go back through the records of his overtime hours in the lab. His job was, he was responsible for the program to develop an anthrax vaccine. So he had every right to be in the lab and to be working on this project overtime if he wanted to. He was fairly senior and fairly independent. So he could go into the lab and check in on weekends and late at night when he wanted to work. So he didn't do it that often, though, and if you look at the chart, you'll see that in early 2001, he wasn't really in there that much. He was in there, some months not at all on the weekends or late at night, some other months, half hour or up to 2 or 3 hours, but never for any substantial length of time. And what you see in the first half of this chart, January to June, was basically typical of the pattern going back several years. But then in August of 2001, you see a big spike. And in September, you see an enormous spike, up to more than 30, I think 32 overtime hours in the lab in September 2001. And then also a significant number in October and November, and then less in December. So this was very suspicious because what was he doing in the lab at the time when the anthrax powder was conceivably being created? Well, we looked at the specific hours leading up to the first mailing window. And as I said, when they got the letters, they were able to look at the postmarks and determine when they had been mailed in order to get that postmark. And the first window for the first set of letters, which were the ones that went to the media, had to be mailed sometime between 5 p.m. on September 17th to 12 noon on September 18th. So they looked at the days obviously right leading up to that mailing window, and the hours are as shown. Dr. Ivins had on Friday 2 hours in the hot suite, which is the part of the lab where that flask is kept. Another 2 hours and some on Saturday, another 2 hours and 37 minutes on Sunday, and the hours when he was in there. So obviously after 9 o'clock on September 14th, after 8 o'clock on Saturday the 15th, and again at night on Sunday before the mailings. So this was pretty suspicious. And it's also important to understand the circumstances of what you had to do to get into what's called the hot suite, where the anthrax was kept. You had to take off all your clothes, go into a changing room, take off all your clothes, put on a decontamination suit, and go in. And then when you came out, you had to take that suit off and shower, and then put your regular clothes on, and then go back out. So it's a little bit of an elaborate process. It's not somewhere you would just go to relax. So for the second mailing window, the letters, as I said, the letters to Senators Leahy and Daschle were mailed a few weeks later. And they did the same thing and went and analyzed the hours. And again, you had very suspicious late hour access to the lab by Dr. Ivins right before the mailing window. And that second mailing window was over Columbus Day weekend, so there were some holidays, so they don't have as narrow a time frame. One important thing to note, I found this important just as a human being trying to understand who would have done something like this. It was hard to envision someone deliberately poisoning innocent victims in the public. So you could think that maybe a scientist thought that there would be a scare in the population, but no one would die. But in fact, the first victim died on October 5th, and that death got a lot of publicity, particularly in the scientific community. And whoever mailed the second batch of letters, which turned out to have a much more potent form of the powder, mailed them sometime after 3 p.m. on October 6th. So Robert Stevens' death was well known. Whoever mailed these letters knew that there was a very high likelihood of people actually dying from this. So that was significant to me anyway in terms of the culpability of who had done this. No, but why would someone do this? When we looked at possible motives for Dr. Ivins, this was his job. He was an anthrax researcher. It was very important to him. Not only because it was his job, but because it was really his life's work. And in the year 2001, there were two things going on. He was in charge of developing the anthrax vaccine, and that vaccine was being tested on monkeys. I apologize, because a lot of people don't agree with that. But in fact, it was being tested on monkeys, and a number of the tests were failing. So the vaccine that he had designed was not working. And so there was a lot of criticism of the program and the amount of money it was costing the Department of Defense. And there were some people saying that the program should be cut and funding transferred elsewhere, and Dr. Ivins should be transferred elsewhere. When they talked to him about that, he was very, very upset. And he said, I am an anthrax researcher. This is what I do. This really was his life's work, and he was very proud of it. It's really all he talked about. And his closest friends were his colleagues, his scientific colleagues. So it was really his life, not just his job and his paycheck. There was something else going on at the time, and that was that the anthrax vaccine and vaccines generally were being criticized as a possible source of Gulf War syndrome, which was the unexplained syndrome that affected a lot of service members from the first Gulf War. And that turns out, I don't think many people think that it really was responsible for Gulf War syndrome, but there was a lot of criticism of the program at the time. And Dr. Ivins was very upset about this criticism and upset about the Defense Department's threat to cut off funding for it. So there's a lot of evidence of this in his email messages to his colleagues, and in fact in some email messages that he sent and postings he made on various bulletin boards where the criticisms were being raised and so forth. So you have to draw it out a little bit, but what was the motive? Presumably he had a motive to make sure that the public was suitably panicked about anthrax and the dangers it posed, so that his project wouldn't get cut, so that the funding wouldn't get cut. Now that doesn't seem like maybe a very significant motive, but to him, again, this was his life's work, and it was very important to him. And ironically, after the anthrax attacks, when there was no more discussion of cutting off the funding for his project, in fact, it worked. If he wanted to keep funding the project, he was successful at it. And in fact, he won a Distinguished Civilian Service Award for his work on the program, again, after the attacks. So that was the theory, at least. He never admitted to what he did, so we don't know what the motive was. But I think that's a pretty significant piece of evidence. Just to talk a little bit more about Dr. Ivins' psychology, and you'll see one of the things that this investigation does is it ties together all sorts of different disciplines, science and psychology, and there's a lot of knowledge being applied. I mean, we had people working on this case from all different areas of expertise, and we were drawing on experts not only in science, but in psychology as well. And the fact is that Dr. Ivins was a very troubled person. He had a history of depression, and we found out that he had been taking, off and on, antipsychotic and antidepressant medications since 2000. He was being treated in a group therapy situation. He didn't have an individual doctor, but he did have a group therapist. And in 2008, when he became aware that he was a suspect and went off the rails, he said things in his group therapy session that led the therapist to file a restraint order with the police, in which she detailed a lot of the statements that he had made confidentially, but there's an exception to the privacy rules for anyone who's a danger to himself or others. And so she wrote this all down in this court filing that she submitted to the police and then to the court, and described him also as a sociopathic with clear intentions. And that was based on things he said in group therapy sessions in the summer of 2008, which I'll get to. But this alone would not be reason to suspect him. But when you know that he has access, that he has these suspicious hours, this is obviously relevant to think, well, what could have made him capable of doing this? There were some other just really interesting sort of psychological facts that we learned during the course of the investigation. He came in voluntarily with his attorney and spoke to the FBI in 2008 and admitted to some obsessions. We had email messages to his colleagues where he's talking about how he gets paranoid and gets delusional and doesn't know what to do about it. He wrote a poem that he sent to one colleague where he talks about, it was to the words of Hickory Dickory Dock, and he talks about, I'm the other half of Bruce. When he lets me out, I push Bruce aside, then I'm free to run about. And again, this itself is not incriminating unless you know that this is the scientist that has access to the anthrax powder and a motive to commit this crime. So it became significant in context. He also admitted to the investigators that he drove sometimes very long distances to deliver packages to people, either people he liked or people he had a vendetta against, and he delivered a poisoned bottle of wine to someone at one point and then took it back. He delivered things to friends who lived long distances away, and this was just interesting because it's traveling a long distance to put something in the mail or mail a package, and that seemed to be somewhat of a pattern. And he freely admitted some of this activity in his interviews with the FBI. He also admitted to being obsessed with a woman he had known in graduate school who was a member of the KKG sorority. And he then became obsessed with the KKG sorority. And this was interesting for a number of reasons. And again, he freely admitted a lot of this in his interviews with the FBI, his obsessions. He went and broke into some chapters of KKG and stole some ritual books, which were some of his treasured possessions. It's a little strange. But this was what was going on in his mind. She actually, the graduate student who he was obsessed with back in graduate school, was one of the people who contacted the FBI and reported him as a suspect. She actually, I think she was the only person who reported him as a suspect. And again, they had a lot of tips, and this didn't stand out in particular. It had been a long time ago that he was in grad school in the 70s, I think, so the obsession dated back quite far. She just reported him as someone who, she thought his behavior had been very odd and perhaps he was capable of doing this. And obviously, again, when you know that he has the flask, it becomes much more significant than it was when it was among thousands of tips reported in 2001. So once he was identified as the suspect, this stood out. The significance of KKG came around again when they found which mailbox the letters had been mailed in. Some of you, I've already given a preview of this in person in Princeton. The mailbox was, the FBI swabbed every mailbox within the postmark area for the letters, and the only mailbox that was contaminated, and this was some months after the the attacks themselves by the time they figured out which mailboxes were in the area of the postmark. So it wasn't fresh, but this mailbox in the middle of this street in Princeton, New Jersey, was the only one of the 621 mailboxes that they swabbed that was contaminated. So they knew then that the letters had been mailed from this box. And if you look at that picture, the one in the middle is a little bit of a different shade of blue than the other two because the FBI took it as evidence and replaced it. So if you ever go to 10 Nassau Street in Princeton, that's really the site of the crime. That 10 Nassau Street, Princeton, is very close to the KKG chapter, the sorority chapter at Princeton, which is at 20 Nassau Street. And again, no one would have ever thought that there was a connection there, but once you know about his KKG obsession, and you know that the letters were mailed from this mailbox, why would someone pick that? Well, maybe he picked it for that reason. We'll never really know, but it's a circumstantial piece of evidence for sure. You would think that whoever was going to mail these letters would not necessarily go to the mailbox on their corner and mail the letters because you can trace the contamination, and that would make you a suspect. So Princeton, New Jersey was quite a ways from Frederick, Maryland, which is where he lived and worked, but there is this connection of sorts. So just moving on to the envelopes that were used, another key piece of evidence. This is really an example of, no expense was spared in this investigation. The mailbox swabbing, obviously very time-consuming. What they did with the envelopes was even more so. These were pre-franked 34-cent envelopes. That meant that they were envelopes that had been purchased with a stamp on there that for 34 cents postage. They figured out, based on the ink and the time frame of when these envelopes were in circulation, that it had to be, these envelopes had to come from a batch of 31 million envelopes that were produced for the Postal Service during this period of time. And they went around and collected every envelope they could find with this 34-cent franc. And many of them had been destroyed and were out of circulation, but they went to all these post offices where the envelopes were sold, and they did find 290,000 some envelopes that had this exact eagle with this exact type of ink that were produced during this period. The eagle is the franc on the postmark there. So they did microscopic analysis of this eagle because the machines that are used to produce these envelopes, they stamp the envelopes over and over again. And over time, the stamp wears out in certain ways that are identifiable if you analyze the mark that is left. And over time, they wear out so much that they have to be replaced. So you could look at what characteristics did that eagle have that would help you narrow down which envelopes were used. And this screen is so huge, you might actually be able to read this. But if you can't, these are all the mailboxes, the post offices where the particular batches of envelopes that closely matched these franked envelopes went. And the main post office in Elkton, Maryland, got a shipment of 500 envelopes on March 21st, 2001. That was the closest match of any of the envelopes that were examined. The post office at Frederick Station in Frederick, Maryland, which is where Dr. Evans lived and worked, received a batch of 1,000 of those envelopes. And the shipments were delivered in order. So you've got to think that the ones that went to Elkton closely matched the ones that went to Frederick. There were no known envelopes recovered from the Frederick batch. So the fact that it matched the Elkton batch closer than any other was, again, very circumstantial, but interesting piece of evidence. This would not help you narrow the universe of suspects, but once you know that you have a suspect that lives and works in Frederick, Maryland, again, this is very incriminating and helped corroborate the evidence we had. Moving to linguistics, there's a little bit of everything in this case, as I said. This does not mean anything to me except for how it illuminates something that he did during the course of the investigation, which I'll get to in a minute. So if you look at the letters, there are highlighted T's and A's in the letters. And this was true of the others. I just have one as an example. And there's this whole sort of science of DNA coding. And again, I don't understand this as much as some of you others. But there are letters that stand for the codons. And then those letters also can be grouped to stand for other things. And this could be, if you look at the T in this, the T in take, the A in penicillin, and look at all the letters that are highlighted. TTA, ATT, TAT stands out. That could be Pat, who was one of his closest friends and one of the women he was somewhat obsessed with, or it could be phenyl, I don't know how to pronounce these things, these substances that begin with FNY. He hated New York. He had an obsession about New York, New York, I don't know. So again, I thought all this was somewhat meaningless and far-fetched, but he had a book all about this in his home. It's this book here, Go to Lesher Bach. There's another very similar one, and these books I don't think would have been significant at all, but after his house was searched, in November 2007, I authorized the search warrants for his house, his cars, and his office space at USAM Red to see if there was any evidence, and the FBI searched his house. And afterward, they found a lot of, again, suspicious sort of letters to various people and, evidence of some of his obsessions, but nothing really incriminating. No letters to another senator with anthrax powder or anything like that. But they recovered what they could, and then the FBI sometimes will look at someone's behavior after a search to see if they make efforts to get rid of anything else incriminating that the FBI didn't find. And they did that in this case. So they were monitoring him in the days after the search. And one night, they were actually outside his house at 1 o'clock in the morning in the woods across the street. And yes. Were they tailing him? Yes, but maybe you have a sense by now of why. He went out to his house. The trash was collected at 1 o'clock in the morning outside his house in Frederick. He went out and took a bag of trash and put it in the trash can. He walked across the street to the woods. They were actually terrified they were going to get blown, but they didn't. He didn't see them. He walked back into the house, and the trash truck came, took the trash, and then the trash truck drove off. He then walked out of his house and stood by, looked in the trash can, made sure the trash was gone, and looked and watched as the trash truck drove around the corner. And the FBI agents in the woods are thinking, yes, there's going to be, anthrax, or there's going to be a letter to Senator so-and-so in that trash bag. And they didn't find anything like that, but what they did find was this book and one other book, and nothing else of significance. So it may not have been important the way I see the case, because I don't understand this coding stuff, but it was obviously very important to him, and he took great steps to try to get rid of this evidence. So there was some other evidence of his guilty conscience. He had emailed the CDC right after the attacks, right after the death of Stevens, suggesting that Stevens may have died from drinking infected creek water or from wearing contaminated wool. And this was nonsense, and an anthrax scientist would certainly know that that couldn't have been what killed Robert Stevens. He'd taken steps to test his workspace and to clean up his workspace, and hadn't reported that. And again, this is a very controlled laboratory because fatal material is kept there. So, and he had also provided sort of a misleading sketch of, where he thought the anthrax derived from. He was one of a number of scientists who the FBI had talked to during the early days of the investigation before he was really a key suspect. And so a lot of his behavior, when they look back, they thought demonstrated guilty conscience. So at this point, the searches were in November of 2007. And based on the suspicious lab hours and just all of this evidence, we thought we should take steps to bring him in and talk to him and ask some questions. And this is when he came in for the interviews in January and February 2008, and couldn't explain the late lab hours and couldn't explain some of the other things. In the first interview, they tried to keep it very cooperative and friendly, and he talked freely about a lot of his obsessions. In the second interview, they asked him some more pointed questions about that codon system and some things that got him very agitated and upset. And when asking about the lab hours, he had a couple of explanations. The first explanation was that he was having a lot of difficulties at home, which was actually true, but he said that he would go into the lab to get away from it all. And again, this is not like a cafe. This is a place where you have to shower, and it's not some place that's particularly relaxing. So they were skeptical of that. He then later said, okay, that's not really true. I was trying to get away from a security guard that I didn't like who worked at the lab, and they went and traced the records, and the security guard wasn't even there during some of the times he was there. So that didn't really add up either. And then they asked him again in February, and he said, I really don't have any explanation for why I was in there. And that became a very key piece of evidence. He had all these lab hours and couldn't explain what he had been doing. He had no project he was working on that demanded all of those hours. And I thought that was very significant. So we began talking to his attorney. He then attempted to commit suicide in March of 2008. So evidently he was aware that he was a suspect and was very upset about this. And this was upsetting to all of us, really. But I was pretty confident that this was the mailer and that we had the right person, even given the history in the case. And so we made a decision to move forward and indict him. And in a case of this magnitude, that required a pretty lengthy process within both the FBI and the Justice Department. But we had drafted an indictment, and my friend Rachel had, in fact, drafted the indictment and the memorandum to support it. And we started talking to his lawyer about the fact that we were going to bring charges, and did he want to try to resolve the case some other way? Could he talk to his client? And that's normal in a case like this. If there could have been a guilty plea, that would have been a very good resolution to this case. It would have had to have been approved by people way above me, but I think given the history, that would have been a good outcome. So we had his lawyer thinking about that, and obviously he was very aware of that. So then he started to unravel in July 2008, and this is when he informed his therapy group that he had a plan to take out coworkers and was going to get a gun. His therapist then reported him to the police, and the police had him taken into custody for evaluation. So he was evaluated at a hospital in Frederick, which concluded that he was not a danger to himself or others, and released him on July 24th. Then on July 26th, he took a fatal overdose of pills and died within, I think, a day and a half. So this was unexpected, but not entirely unexpected. We were concerned, just based on the prior suicide attempt and what he had said in July, that he could do this. We were internally wondering, really, what should we do? Should we be moving more quickly with the indictment so that we can get him taken into custody? There were still people, and there still are today, who think that the FBI didn't actually get it right, that this is not the guy. So we knew there was going to be a lot of scrutiny. We knew we had to get the right approvals. But in hindsight, it's sort of obvious that this is where this could have led. At the time, it was really hard to know whether we should have moved things up. I mean, after he committed suicide, I asked myself these questions a lot. This was not how anyone wanted this case to end. It was tremendously sad for his family. It didn't bring resolution to the case because we never were able to prove it in court. So could we have avoided this? I still don't know whether there was anything I could have done to try to move forward more quickly or prevent him from taking his life. We did contact the hospital and provide the hospital everything that we could legally provide to tell them that we thought that this was a risk. And they evaluated that and evaluated him and released him. So it's hard to say if there was something else we could have done. But to me, this is really what we are, as liberal arts graduates, trained to do. Try to think things through, try to prevent what happened here, and it's part of its liberal arts, as you all know, is not just science and psychology and math and so forth, but really the ability to think critically and analyze and draw connections. And when I think about my work on this case, and all of our work on this case, really, I think about, we really applied all of these skills that we're taught and that we're taught really to continue developing in life. So for that reason, I think it's actually an interesting example of sort of how to apply the education that we get at a place like Williams. This is from the Williams College mission statement. Steve Balsito, you were talking earlier about the website. I went on the website. It's actually great language. There are other things that you could think about, openness and global perspectives that maybe the next group of trustees will put in there that I think are also important values. But these are obviously very key values. And what I particularly love is the civic virtue of installing a commitment to engage in the broad public realm and to engage in community life and the skills to do so effectively. And I think those are skills when you're leading an investigation like this that are so important. And I think this gave me the opportunity to really exercise many of these skills, but all of our careers provide those opportunities. Again, the questions that we asked, I'll never know whether we did the right thing. The one thing that we did do when he committed suicide and that brought the case to a conclusion was we asked the Attorney General for approval to have a press conference to explain this to the public, because we wanted to explain to the public that we'd identified the mailer and that the case could be closed. The case wasn't actually closed for another year because they were still evaluating some evidence to make sure they had just done everything they could. But we did get approval to do that, which was very unusual, because in a case where you don't have a trial, things aren't really public. But in this case, they made exceptions to that policy. So I'm going to move on to sort of the next phase I wanted to talk about. Any questions about that, or are people going to be polite and wait? That's fine. Just to talk for a minute, because I've gone on and on, but as counselor to the Attorney General, after this case concluded, President Obama was elected and came in and appointed Eric Holder to be his Attorney General. And Eric Holder had been in justice before, but didn't have a lot of national security experience after the 9/11 attacks. And he knew me, and he knew I was experienced in this area, so he brought me in to advise him on national security matters. And I didn't know when I accepted the job that the Department of Justice would be taking a lead role in the executive order issued right after President Obama was inaugurated, which directed the task forces be set up to review interrogation policy and detention policy, and really to review all of the detainees who were still held in Guantanamo, and to close Guantanamo. But that's what I worked on for the almost 2 years I worked for Eric Holder. And in talking about Guantanamo specifically, I got to help set up the task force that reviewed all of the detainees. And this was really the key step to closing the facility. What do you do with the 241 people who were there? And we set up a task force, appointed a head of that. It was an interagency task force with representatives from the State Department, the Defense Department. Betsy Anderson's husband, Steve Pumper, I don't think they're here yet, but he worked with me on it. And it was really a group of really talented people from all across government, and they sat down with all of the available information on all of these detainees and made decisions about what should happen to each of them. The decisions, even though you had very differing views within the agency process, the State Department's views were consistently quite different from the intelligence community views on particular detainees, but we ended up reaching unanimous decisions just by trying to hammer out consensus and get people to talk through their differences and agree. And this was internally a tremendously successful process, to have unanimous decisions about all 241 detainees. But the politics of Guantanamo were not successful, and Congress started pouncing on President Obama for a whole number of things, including national security. And we had reviewed a certain number of these detainees for prosecution and determined whether they should be prosecuted in military commissions or in federal courts. This was the key case, Khaled Sheikh Mohammed and 5 co-defendants who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. There are 6 who are in Guantanamo, and of course Eric Holder decided that they should be prosecuted in federal court rather than in military commissions, and that was very controversial in Congress. I just wanted to talk about that for a bit because I was on the team that looked at this and that really looked at the evidence to determine whether the cases should be tried in federal court or in military commissions. And this case has not been tried yet. So unlike the anthrax case, I can't go through step by step what all the evidence was. But there were very good reasons to try the case in federal court rather than in military commissions, just based on the history of trying defendants in terrorism defendants in federal courts, some of the evidentiary rules, some of the different evidence that the military prosecutors wanted to use compared to the evidence that the federal prosecutors wanted to use. They were going to be slightly different cases, and the rules were going to be slightly different. But we never had a chance to try it in federal court because after Eric Holder announced his decision, it was attacked politically, and I think the administration had different battles that it wanted to fight on the economy and healthcare, and didn't want to fight this one, and didn't. And so it really we were never able to explain this to the public. But it's unfortunate because Congress ultimately passed a law that basically restricted any bringing of Guantanamo detainees into the United States for prosecution here, based on the sort of message of fear. You know, why President Obama? Why does he want to bring terrorists into the United States to try them? Well, the truth is we've been prosecuting terrorists in the United States for many years very successfully, and could have done so here. But the one person who did support this decision very publicly was Jon Stewart, who had a great show. I don't know if any of y'all saw it, but he said, "Why not bring him to New York? Bring him on, New Yorkers can handle it." And I still love Jon Stewart for that. He was right. But it never did happen. And again, this is sort of a point in my career where I think about, well, you know, could we have done anything differently? I think the administration as a whole could have, but it was very tough politically and very difficult and very frustrating in many ways, but an amazing opportunity to work on a fascinating case. So one thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the fear that I think was able ultimately to convince Congress to pass a law preventing the Guantanamo detainees from being tried in the United States. If you look at it rationally, if you look at all the factors that I had access to, you would reach a different decision. But the public wasn't really looking at these factors. And I think that there was a lot of playing on fear. And Eric Schmidt talked about this very eloquently this morning, the lack of resiliency in the American public today. And I think it is important to teach people to think and not to fear. And one point I wanted to make basically in closing is that what makes our government work, not only the people in government, but the people in our democracy who vote and who answer pollsters and who help drive some of these decisions, need to think, not fear. And in preparing for this, I wanted to know, and in reading this book and reading about how many of you are in education, I wanted to know how many Williams grads end up in education, and an extraordinary number end up teaching at one point or another. A lot of us right out of college, but a full 20% are still in education now, so about a fifth of the alumni teach, which is a really high number. And I have to say to all of you who have taught, who still teach, who will continue to teach, you are who makes the world go round, because this is really what makes our democracy work and makes public service work. So thank you all, and that's my message. I can talk about a few alumni. Oh, but we do have some questions. Yes. He was going to do it before 9/11, because if you look at the lab hours, some of them are in August. So he was going to do it. And then if you look at the letters, they obviously play off of 9/11. So I think he used that to his advantage, but I think he was planning to do this even before the 9/11 attacks. So, yes. We didn't think he was fine.
What percent of people who were released, really?
There was a small session earlier today where we were talking about the mental health system, and a lot of you, again, know a lot more about this than I do, but I think that it failed him, and he wasn't probably being adequately treated for the problems that he had, and there was nothing that we could do about that. We were very concerned that the hospital was making the wrong decision, but they were trained doctors and we were not, and so we couldn't really do anything about it other than what we tried to do unsuccessfully. So, yes? Excellent point. Yep, people have thought about that. No, in fact, the lab has taken steps to try to monitor more closely. It's obviously a difficult, tricky area in terms of privacy, but they do scrutinize. Employees who have access to deadly materials there is more monitoring, which I think this case taught us there should be. So the labs do have different policies. Okay, Suzanne. I will tell you that the director said, don't spare any expense. You find who did this. And it got a lot of funding. It had a lot of agents. It had a lot of man hours. And because of the fear, and really, I mean, it did kill 5 people, and it was a potentially ongoing threat. Not knowing who did that could mean that someone was in the lab developing anthrax to poison entire reservoirs, and we didn't know. So I think it was a real public safety concern. And it was a lot of money, but I don't think that there's certainly, until they found out who did it, there was no one who was going to say, you know, let's cut some people from that squad. So, Dave. Why did he stop? Because his program got, I mean, if you think we're right about the motive, then he was successful and he didn't need to, you know, I mean, obviously he still had some problems, but he accomplished what he set out to do, I think. So, yes? Right. It'll be hard to close Guantanamo, just given the political situation right now. Congress has repeatedly prohibited any funding to do that. So with respect to that, and you also asked about the pros and cons of the military commissions versus the federal courts. There are different evidentiary rules. The case was proceeding in the military commissions, and that was a big factor in favor of the military commissions. But when we looked at some evidence that the prosecutors looked at that they thought they could use in federal court, there were some categories of evidence. One that I can talk about is our allies overseas would not allow us to use evidence that they had provided in the military commissions, just based on a principled they would not allow them to be used in the military commissions. They would have allowed them to be these pieces of evidence in it. So that was a factor. There were some other pieces of evidence that the military prosecutors were unsure about because they'd never used them in the military system, whereas the federal prosecutors were very confident that under federal law you could get some statements and communications admitted. So there were some real evidentiary issues that tipped the balance, in my view, to prosecuting it in federal court. I think it's a winnable case in either forum, so it wasn't an obvious decision. And again, it had been in the military commissions, and that was one factor in favor of keeping it there. But that's where it is anyway, and the trial will take place in a couple of years, and we'll see what happens. So. Oh, sorry, I can't see these lights. Yes. Don't jump. Yeah, so he hasn't been charged, and you know, it's unclear whether he will be charged. It looks like he will be extradited to Sweden to face trial on the sex offenses that he's charged with there. And at this point, there's no effort to bring him into the United States. So that's all I'll say about that. So, yes, sorry, back there. I will say that the FBI was monitoring him, that he wasn't going to get to Mexico. And they were also monitoring him to make sure that he wasn't going to hurt others, and that was our primary concern. And ultimately, we didn't want him to hurt himself either, but we couldn't control what he ended up doing within his own home. You know, they weren't in his home. So that, again, I don't think they could have prevented. But with respect to your first point about this was overwhelming evidence, I think so. And I thought it was a pretty convincing case at the time. But even now, there are members of Congress who think the FBI never got the right guy because they haven't proven their case. So it wasn't a slam dunk because it is.
You just need one judge to give you an arrest warrant?
Correct. I mean, we could have sought an arrest warrant and we could have gotten one. The question was, when were we going to do that? We were moving toward doing that, and he moved first, is really what happened. But that is the question that I asked myself. Should we have taken decisive action earlier? Should we have tried to push things through when it looked like he was moving in that direction? And maybe we should have, but it's a whole bureaucracy and hard to control. So,
unfortunately, we need to end, but please, thank you, Amy.